In the world of Tamriel, mysteries are as plentiful as the stars in the sky. Some are whispered about in quiet corners, while others have long since faded into forgotten history. But among these lost tales, there is one that stands out: the story of the Lilmothiit, the foxfolk of Blackmarsh. Living in the dense swampland of southeastern Tamriel, the Lilmothiit were a race of fox-like creatures, humanoid in form but with the distinct features of their vulpine ancestors. The pocket guide to the Empire suggests that they might have shared a distant connection with the Khajiit of Elsweyr. While no one can say for certain, it's an interesting thought. Were the Lilmothiit distant cousins of the Khajiit, or is their similarities just a coincidence of evolution? Either way, these mysterious people were nomadic, moving from place to place in search of survival. But they weren't entirely without their roots. Settlements like Lilmoth, a major port city on the southern tip of Murkmire, and Blackrose, a settlement in Murkmire near the Murkwood forest, shows us that despite their nomadic nature, they possessed the knowledge and strength to create long-lasting structures. But due to their itinerant ways, these buildings might have served as temporary sanctuaries in times of crisis, destinations for religious journeys, or possible spots for tribes to trade before retreating back to their own personal camps. Still, these structures speak to a people capable of creating something that could endure in a world full of constant change. In terms of daily life for the Lilmothiit, the details are as elusive as their people. What is clear, however, is that they were resourceful. Based on lingering tales and stories, the foxfolk hunted using spears, fought using swords, and traded with other tribes to survive, carrying large packs to haul their wares, and using walking sticks to ease the burden of travelling long distances with heavy goods. Their tools, while few and far between, hint at a culture deeply connected to the land they called home. Elegant yet functional, these artifacts might have been as much about utility as they were symbols of identity, like the curious Lilmothiit fox kite, a sleek paper kite painted bright orange and featuring a real fox's tail. It's unclear whether this was a playful children's toy, a tool for communication, or a more profound cultural symbol, but it's easy to imagine it representing something of their spirits, perhaps even their connection to the world around them and their ability to drift from one location to another. Their social structure also remains a mystery. One could see the Lilmothiit living in a loose, free society, perhaps with leadership based on wisdom, skill, or experience, but this is pure speculation. What is certain, though, is that like many nomadic people, they passed down their stories orally, ensuring that their history lived on through word of mouth. So while they have seemingly disappeared and their stories with them, certain other races, like the Argonians, have kept their stories alive. Now, the relationship between the Lilmothiit and the Argonians is ambiguous at best, but some legends suggest a certain tension between the two races, possibly sparked by territorial disputes or cultural differences. As the Argonians began to solidify their dominance in Blackmarsh, it's thought that the Lilmothiit may have retreated deeper into the wilds, perhaps driven out by the growing Argonian population or the changing landscape. While their disappearance is strange, there is an event that certainly hurried their vanishing along, and perhaps even caused their disappearance in the first place, and that is the Nahatan Flu. The Nahatan Flu started in Stormhold, the largest settlement in the Shadowfen region, and persisted for 41 years. The flu quickly spread to every corner of Blackmarsh and beyond, driving the Lilmothiit, as well as other races like the Kothringi, to extinction. The native Argonians were largely immune to this plague, causing some to believe it was fabricated by an Argonian shaman, who in retaliation for the awful treatment of his people by other races, created the flu through a manipulation of their cherished spore trees. To the Argonians, the flu was merely a mild sickness which they called the half-swim sniffles, but to the other races, it was horrific. Early symptoms included loss of appetite and fatigue, followed by aching muscles, chills, and watery eyes. Then a racking cough, high fever, and blood flowing from the nose, eyes, and mouth. The most visible sign of the disease was a red granular rash that didn't itch. Usually the afflicted would die after 3 painful days of infection, but reports suggest for some victims it could take a week. There is more to say about the Nahatan flu, but long story short, the Lilmothiit were unable to best its contagious and deadly nature. The last recorded case of the flu was in the Second Era 603, after a group of Kothringi tribesmen fled Blackmarsh by boat and disappeared, while the Foxfolk took a different approach, packing up their belongings and venturing further inland. It's possible that this flu, combined with the Argonians' rise to power, pushed them into near extinction, but it's also important to consider other factors as well. Conflict with neighbouring tribes, shifts in the environment of Blackmarsh, or even internal struggles, any of which could have attributed to their disappearance. While most of the Lilmothiit's legacy has faded, remnants of their existence still linger in the ruins and artifacts they left behind. One story, known as the Gift of the Lilmothiit, mentions how a Lilmothiit Kit, called Khazar, having escaped from slavers, stumbled upon an Argonian village while making his way home. GT, an Argonian hatchling, was one of the few Argonians to trust Khazar, as the Lilmothiit people were said to be full of tricks and couldn't be trusted. But GT's mother had grown increasingly ill, as had many of her people. A strange fever was taking hold of her village. The spread was slow at first, and the village healers dealt with fevers and took care of people who had trouble keeping down food. But soon enough, the healer's hut was full, and they couldn't care for everyone. GT's mother was one of the latest to fall ill, and the healers could do little more than make her comfortable. GT, wanting to help her mother, and having heard stories about the Lilmothiit people's cure, followed Khazar back to his camp. The journey took several days, and she was starting to doubt the Kit's story and the existence of his camp, but it was there, just as he described. Looking down on the camp, there was hardly any signs of life. Embers and charcoal gathered in a tight circle, holes poked into the ground from tent poles, and tracks leading east. The Lilmothiit had been here, but they had moved on, taking their medicine with them. Or so it seemed, as Khazar emerged shortly after, carrying a clay jar between his hands. Inside was Mother's Mix, a thick paste reeking of pungent herbs, a mix said to clear all sickness, a gift from his tribe to hers. Medicine that GT would use to heal her mother and the other sick people inside the healer's hut. As for Khazar, he followed the tracks east to find his people and was never seen again. This story has a few interesting things, but the first thing I want to talk about is the mention of Khazar escaping from slavers. Argonians have not traditionally kept slaves, as they despised the enslavement of their own kind by the Dunmer and don't want to subject others to the same treatment. However, under the effects of the Mad Hist, certain Argonians have enslaved many of their own kind. Argonian mothers would sometimes sell their own children into slavery, and in Thorn, a city in Blackmarsh, heavily influenced by Morrowind due to it being on the province's border, kept many slaves in and around the city. Although the Argonians doing so were generally despised by their own kind, who considered them to be traitors. If Khazar had escaped from Argonian slavers, this would explain the uneasy relationship the two races have in the story, as the Lilmothiit were unsure which Argonians they could trust, perhaps employing trickery to avoid them altogether, giving us another reason for their disappearance and the Argonians' uneasiness towards Khazar in the story. Another interesting thing is Mother's Mix and the fever the Argonians were experiencing. At first I thought this could have been the Nahatan flu, but sources state the flu didn't really affect Argonians, and this fever was killing them, so it must have been a different disease. That, and the fact the Nahatan flu decimated the Lilmothiit population, and if Mother's Mix, something they had, could have cured that illness, then they would have surely used it, so I'm fairly sure it was something else. Then again, what if Mother's Mix did cure the Nahatan flu and the Lilmothiit retreated for other reasons, like slavery? But due to the timing, people believed it was the Nahatan flu that caused their disappearance. It's pure speculation, but interesting to think about. Regardless of the reason for their disappearance, the Lilmothiit withdrew from the coast, relocating to the inland regions around Blackrose, where they faded into obscurity. But their ruins were left behind, and they are one of the only things that still exist to suggest they were more than myth. structures that prove they were great builders, and it's for that reason why some of their buildings were repurposed by other races. The Akaviri, for instance, repurposed Lilmothiit ruins for their own needs, with the city of Blackrose itself being converted into a prison. Since then, the ruins have been used by several different races for various reasons, but in that time, not a single Lilmothiit has returned. So, are they truly gone, or have they simply retreated into the shadows, hidden away in some forgotten corner of Tamriel? Throughout history, many races thought to be extinct have resurfaced in one form or another. The Falmer, for example, once proud snow elves, now stalk the dark caves of Skyrim. The Dwemer, though their civilization was erased in a single day, may still exist in some forgotten dimension. Could the Lilmothiit be the next to resurface? Some believe it's possible. Of course, not everyone shares this belief. In the book An Argument for Common Sense, the skeptical author dismisses the very idea of certain beastfolk, including the Lilmothiit, believing their existence is mere fantasy. He argues that tales of the foxfolk are nothing more than fanciful exaggerations, much like the strange variations of the Khajiit. The Palmer, for example, are larger than your average Khajiit with immense strength, but they are still Khajiit nonetheless, and the same could be said for the Lilmothiit, a smaller and more timid breed of Khajiit. Yet, for every skeptic, there's a dreamer, driven by the hope that somewhere hidden from view, the Lilmothiit still live on. Their items, ruins, and stories speak to a people who were once here, and maybe, just maybe, as long as these remnants survive, the foxfolk are not as lost as we think. Whether they disappeared because of the Nahatan flu, were driven out by the Argonians and their slavery, or simply chose to fade away to preserve their own way of life, their legacy lives on. And with their concept art in Elder Scrolls Online showing us how they would have appeared in the game, then perhaps one day the foxfolk will make an appearance in a later game or future update. But until that day comes, we can only wonder what happened to them.